Okay, so we'll go ahead and start now. So I hope everyone's doing okay. Your week 7 material was due 5 p.m. today, and tonight we're going to start on new material, week 8 vectors. So we will do as many sections as we can, and whatever we don't do in this session, you'll be expected to do it on your own time. So let's start with 8.1, array vector concepts. Okay, so a typical variable stores one data item, like the number 59 or the character A. Instead, sometimes a list of data items should be stored. For example, a program recording points scored in each quarter of a basketball game needs a list of 4 numbers, right? Requiring a programmer to declare 4 variables is annoying, and 200 variables would be ridiculous. And an array is a special variable having one name but storing a list of data items, with each item being directly accessible. Some languages use a construct similar to an array called a vector. Um, each element in an array is known as an element. So uh, this participation activity shows an array. So I'll start this. So num players is just an int variable, and it stores only one data item. In this case, it's 12, right? Some variables should store a list of data items, like variable points per quarter that stores 4 items. So as you can see here, this variable called points per quarter is an array because it stores 4 int variables instead of just one. See? Each element is accessible, like the element number 3. Like so, items in an array are numbered from 0 to n minus 1. So if points per quarter is an array that stores 4 items, their indices are labeled 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Now, you might think of a normal variable as a truck and an array variable as a train. A truck has just one car for carrying data, but a train has many cars, each of which can carry data. Okay. In an array, each element's location number is called an index. So the way you access members of an array is you say the name of the array, and in square brackets, you put the index of the the item that you're trying to access, right? So an array's key feature is that the index enables direct access to an element, as in my array 2. Different languages use different syntax. Like some languages might use syntax like this, where you use parentheses instead of square brackets, or you say not at and then the index. Okay, so if you look at this participation activity, you can learn how to access different array elements of the array. So I'm going to click start here. So update my items with my items index at 1 equals 34. So if I said in a line of code my items, which is this array here, at index 1 equals 34, which one of these am I going to change? It would be the number at index 1. Now, a common mistake some programmers might make is that they see 1 and they say, oh, I'm going to change the first element. That's actually incorrect. The first element is index 0, but here we're trying to change index 1, which is actually the second element. So I'm going to change this to 34, and we can check. All right, so now this line of code asks us to change my items at 3 to 54. So I will go to position or index number 3 and change this to 54. And that should be correct. Okay, so here's the next one. Let's say I want my items at index 3 to equal my items at index 2. How would I do that? Well, I'll go to index 3 and change it to whatever value is in index 2. So since index 2 is 32, I have to change this to 32. And I can check. Okay. Right, now it says update my items with my items 4 equals my items 2. So I will go to 4 and change that to whatever number is in 2. So I see 28, so I'll change this to 28. And I'll check. It's correct. Here's a good one. So this one says my items at index 3 equals my items at index 3 plus 2. How would I do this one? Well, it looks like my items at 3 equals 23. So I'll just add 2 more and change it to 25. Okay. And then lastly, update my items with my items at 2 equals my items at 2 plus 5. So I will go to 2 and add 5 to this. So this will change to 39. There we go. Okay, so now you know how to access items in an array, right? So here's a participation activity. So did this go over how to declare an array? Well, I guess I'll show it to you. I'll call this array. Did Professor Muir already go over arrays? Or should I just show this anyways? He finished the chapter? Oh. Okay, well, I'll show this anyways. It doesn't hurt. So the way you declare an array is the same way you would declare a normal variable. Like if, let's say I want to declare an array of type int. So I would say int, I'll say the name of my array, but then in square brackets, I should say the number of items that's in the array. So if I wanted this array to contain 5 items, I would say 5 here. Now, like with, so I'll say another int variable, but this one's not an array. Int. So this is one variable, but this is an array of 5 objects. Right? Now, with just like any variable, I can have my I can have it be initialized or uninitialized. So if I wanted to initialize int var, I would set it equal to something like 7. But if I wanted to initialize this, because it says it contains 5 objects, I would have to list 5 objects in squiggly brackets separated by commas. So I would say probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the data at index 0 is 1. The data at index 1 is 2, and then 3, 4, 5. And if you wanted to see me access the data in this array, I would simply say int array at the index that I want. And then that would simply be it. So I will copy this a couple more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. So this should output 1, this should output 2, this should output 3, this should output 4, and this should output 5. And it does. But that's how you declare an array. It's kind of odd that this section didn't really go over it. But anyways, back to the sections. Array people per day has 365 elements. Now, you can imagine how useful arrays would come in. Like, if you needed to declare 365 int variables, would you rather declare 365 int variables or declare one array that has 365 objects? Obviously, making the array is easier, right? Okay, so valid accesses are people per day 0, 1, ... to 364, right? So question 1 says, which assigns element 0 with a value of 250? Say in the chat what you think the correct answer is. But these are our 3 options. How would we assign element 0 with 250? Well, we would say people per day, which is the name of the array, and then square brackets say the index which we're trying to change, and then have it equal to the value we're trying to change. So it would be the second one, right? So question 2 says, which assigns element 1 with a value of 99? How many people think it's the first one, and how many people think it's the second one? Yeah, it would be the first one, right? Okay. Question 3 says, what is the value of people per day at number 8, given that these lines of code have executed? So people per day at index 9 equals 5, and then people per day at index 8 equals index 9 minus 3. Well, this one's not too hard to figure out, right? Because we know that this is equal to 5, we say 5 minus 3, which is going to be 2, right? Exactly. Last question. Assume n is initially 1. What is the value of people per day at 2? So let's say n is initially 1. So people per day at index 1 is going to be equal to 15. And then we increment n by 1. So n will become 2. So people per day at position 2 equals people per day at position 1 times 3. this one's a tricky one. Does anyone know what the correct answer is? I say it's going to be 45 because people per day at 1 is going to be equal to 15. And for increment n, we will take we will set position 2 to equal to 15 times 3, which is going to be 45, right? Like that, see? All right. Here's another participation activity. So an array scores list has 10 elements with indices 0 through 9 accessed as scores list 0 to scores list 9. Assign the first element in scores list with 77. How would we do this? Well, we have to remember that the index of the first element is always 0. So in square brackets, I'm going to put 0 and then set this equal to 77. Like that. Assign the second element in scores list with 77. Well, the second element in an array is always going to be indexed with the number 1. So I will say scores list at position 1 equals 77, like that. And this should be correct. Yep. All right. Lastly, assign the last element with 77. How do I access the last element? Well, the index of the last element is always going to be the size of the array minus 1. So 10 minus 1 is going to be 9. So I have to say scores list at 9 equals 77, right? Equals 77. Right. Question 4 says, if that array instead has 100 elements, so instead of having 10 elements, let's say that it had 100 elements, what would be, what is the last element's index? What would it be? Yeah, it would be 99 because since it's n is 100, the index of the last element would be that much minus 1. So I will say 99, correct. And then lastly, if the array's last index was 499, how many elements does the array have? It would just be this number plus 1, right? Yeah, 500. Okay, so this pretty much covers arrays. Okay, so now we can move on to section 8.2, which is all about vectors. Now, arrays and vectors are very similar in the respect that they can hold more than one data, right? But the biggest difference between a vector and an array is that when you actually, I'll demonstrate it right now. So when you use an array and you say that the size of the array is equal to 5, the size of the array is always going to be equal to 5 throughout the entire program. You actually cannot change the size of the array anywhere in the program. So if it was equal to 5, you can't change it to 4 or you can't change it to 6. It's always fixed at 5. Okay. So with a vector, it allows you to do something called dynamic storage. That basically means that you can change the size of the vector at any point throughout the program. And so if you'd like me to, I can demonstrate how to make a vector here. So vectors, before I declare any vector, you should note that vector has its own library and it's called vector. So I'm going to have to go to the top, say include vector. So this gives me access to the vector library, right? So now I can start declaring vectors. So I said that this was an array of 5 objects, right? Now let's say I want to make a vector of 5 objects, okay? So the way I would declare a vector is I would say int, but then in chevrons, I put the keyword vector, like that. And then after this, I would declare the name of the vector. In this case, to be consistent, I'm just going to call this vector int vector because I called this one int array. So I'll say int array, like that. I believe that's how you do it, right? Oh, my bad. I actually got that mixed around. So vector should actually be outside. My bad. And this should be int. Yeah, I felt like something was wrong. All right, so now I have a vector, right? How would I fill this vector with information? So I don't know if this section mentions it, but well, maybe it will mention it later on down the road. But the way that I would use a vector is that vectors always have functions associated with. I had a PowerPoint before. I think I can pull it up. Excuse me. So this was actually a PowerPoint that I used for my last class. And the only reason I pulled it up is because I wanted to show this table to you. So, vectors have an associated list of functions with it. There's the dot clear function, which erases all the elements of the container. There's the insert function, but which allows me to put any element in between any 2 elements. But the way that I would put elements inside of a vector is actually the pushback function. Okay. So if I wanted to put 5 elements here, I would say the name of the vector. And say dot push back. And then inside the open close parentheses, I say the element that I'm trying to push back. So let's say I want to push back elements 1 through 5, the same way I did for the array. So I would say push back 1, and then a new line, I say push back 2, push back 3, push back 4, and push back 5. Like that, see? So If you wanted me to see out the elements of int vector, I would say something. Let me give myself some space. I would say something similar to this, right? But instead of I would say the name of the vector and then in square brackets say the element I'm trying to access, right? So let me copy this, put this here, and change int array to int vector. So if you wanted to see the elements of the vector this time, so these were the elements of the array, and these were the elements of the vector, right? Now, the biggest difference between vector and an array, as I said before, is that you can change the size of the vector, but you can't change the size of an array. So what if I wanted to add an item to vector? All I would have to do is somewhere in my program, I can just say push back again, and I can say the element that I want to add to the end of the list. In this case, I might want to say push back 1,000, like that. And so now the size of the vector is going to be 6. And to access the last element, I would say int vector at position n minus 1, in that case, it's going to be 5, right? So by doing that, I increased the size of my vector now, so now it has 6 elements. See? In order to remove elements from the list, like I would simply have to use the pop back function. This deletes the last element of the vector. So if I didn't want to have 1,000 here, I would simply say int vector dot pop back. And this would delete the last element. So the 1,000 would be gone. Well, you can't see it here, but it's gone. But anyways, that's the big difference between arrays and vectors. Anyways, so 8.2 says a programmer commonly needs to maintain a list of items just as people often maintain lists of items like a grocery list or a course roster. A vector is an ordered list of items of a given data type, the same way an array is, right? Each element in a vector is called an element, same with an array. A programmer must include vector at the top of the file when planning to use vectors. And that's exactly what I demonstrated here with my little program, right? So yeah. So this is the syntax to declare a vector, okay? The statement above declares a vector with a specified number of elements, each element of a specified data type. The type of each vector element is specified with angle brackets. So that's actually what I did here. Because I wanted this vector to contain ints, I just put int as a data type. Now, if I wanted to use a vector of floats, I would put float instead. If I wanted to use a vector of strings, I would put string instead, right? The type of each, yeah, I already said this. The number of vector elements is specified within parentheses following the vector name. So if you said vector int game scores, it declares a vector with 4 integer elements, okay? Terminology note, these are called braces. These are called angle brackets or chevrons. if you have studied arrays, then you know that a vector was added to C++ as a safer and more powerful form of arrays discussed elsewhere. So here's our first participation activity. So a vector declaration creates multiple variables in memory, each accessible using the .at function. Okay, so in the first line of code here, we declared an int array that contains 3 items, index 0 through 2, right? So now the following lines of code initializes the data at those locations in the vector. And because we're outing item counts at position 1, because at 1 was 119, it outputs 119. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's another participation activity. So given we have a vector of ints called years list, and years list has 4 elements, and we initialize indexes 1, 0, 1, and 2, right? How many elements does the vector declaration create? Type in chat what do you think the correct answer is. If you think it's 0, 1, 3, or 4. You think it's 3? I would think that it's 4, right? Well, let's try 3 first. Yeah. It would actually be 4 because we said 4 in here. Even though we only initialized 3 of the 4 elements, the vector actually contains 4 things. So question 2 says, with what value is years list.ats 1 assigned? Well, that's easy to figure out. We can just look in here and we can see that years list.at 1 equals 2012, right? So the answer should be 2012, right? So the next one says, with what value does current year equal? Wait a second. With what value does current year equals years list.at2 assign current year? So basically, it's asking what's going to be the value of this after we set it equal to this. Well, that's really easy. We can just look at the code and see what's value we assigned to index 2. And it looks like it's going to be 2025. So we say this. Yep. Okay, so this one is a good question. Is current year equals years list.at for a valid assignment? How many of you think it is, and how many of you think it isn't? Okay, well, I would argue that this isn't a valid assignment, and the reason why is because we initialized the first 3 positions, but we didn't initialize the 4th position. So I would say no. All right, question 5 says, what is the proper way to access the first element in vector years list? Well, as we already know, the first element of the vector is indexed with 0. So the correct answer should be this one, years list.add 0, like that. And then question 6 says, What are the contents of the vector if the above code is followed by the statement years list dot add 0 equals years list dot add 2? What do we think it's going to be? Well, the values of this vector is going to be 199, 2012, 2025, and then 0 because the last element was not initialized. But if we say that position 0 is going to be equal to position 2, we would actually change this to 2025. So I would say that the correct answer here would be 2025, 2012, 2025, and then 0. So this answer, like that. And then lastly, what is the index of the last element of the following vector? Vector int prices list 100. Yeah. What is the index of the last element? Well, as always, to access the last element is going to be the size of the vector n minus 1. So I would say that the last index is 99 because it's going to be n minus 1. Like that. See? Okay, so let's read this section here. So this one says using an expression for a vector index. A powerful aspect of vectors is that the index is an expression. For example, user nums.atI uses the value held in the int variable I as an index. As such, a vector is useful to easily look up the nth item in the list. A vector's index must be an unsigned integer type. A vector index cannot be a floating type, so you can't have it be 0.0 or 1.0, so on. The program below shows a user to print the age of the nth oldest known person to have ever lived. The program quickly accesses the nth oldest person's age using oldest person dot at nth person minus 1. Note that the index nth person minus 1 is this rather than nth person because a vector's indices start at 0. Okay, so I keep that in mind. So here we have a vector, and we have to include vector in order to use vectors, right? We have a vector with 5 elements, and those elements are initialized with these 5 values. See? So we ask the user to enter a value for n, and it must be between 1 and 5, right? So we get nth person, and we say the nth, if the value of nth person is within 1 and 5, we will say the nth person, oldest person lived is this. So if we enter 1, we will say, this will say the first old person lived is, and then we'll access the index at 1 minus 1, which is going to be 0, and it outputs 122. See? If we enter 4, I'll say the fourth person, oldest person lived is, and then we take nth person minus 1, which is going to be 3, and we take the third index and output 117. See? So looking at this participation activity, it says, in the program above, what is the purpose of this check? Well, because the indices of the vector has to be between 1 and 5, this makes it so that we don't access an index beyond that range. Because if we try to access an index of a vector that's outside the range, it would actually crash our program. So I would say that the correct answer is this, to ensure only valid vector elements are accessed, because the vector oldest people only has 5 elements, like that. See? Okay, so now that we have a good framework about vectors, we can start answering these questions now. So this one says, declare a vector named myvals that stores 10 items of type int. Does anyone have any suggestions? Well, the syntax for a vector is over here, right? So copying this, I would say vector, and inside angle brackets, I would say the data type. In this case, it's going to be int, right? And then the name of my vector, which is going to be myvals. And then in order to store 10 items, I would have to put 10 in parentheses like this. So like that. So if we check our answer, it's correct. Okay. All right, so now I want to write a line of code that assigns x with the value stored at the index of 8 of the vector myvals. How would I do that? I'll just simply assign x to equal myvals. And in square brackets, I will say the index. So 8. So it says to use the add function, but I believe it would still work even if you did it this way. Yeah, so even though that it said my previous answer was wrong, I think you can access it the same way either way. So because I was able to access these vector elements using square brackets. Okay, so question 3 says, given myvals has 10 elements, assign the last element in myvals with the value 555. How would I do this? Well, as we already know, the index of the last elements of the vector is going to be n minus 1, right? So I'm going to say myvals dot at 9 is going to be equal to 555. And that should be correct. Right? Question 4 says, assign myvals element at the index held in current index with the value 777. Okay, so the difference between this one and this one is that instead of having a specific index, like say 9, I have to use the index current index. So I would simply say myvals dot at, and instead of putting a number, I would say current index, right? And then I would say that this equals the value that I'm setting it to. In this case, it's going to be 777. Okay, and then lastly, this one says, assign temp val with the myvals element at the index 1 after the value held in variable I. So how would I do this one? They're trying to throw curveballs at you with these questions. Well, here's how I would do it. I would say temp val equals, and I need to set it equal to myvals element at index 1 after the value held in variable I. So I would probably say myvals at position I plus 1, right? And I believe that should do it. There we go. Okay, so so this next section is about loops and vectors, all right? A key advantage of vectors becomes evident when used in conjunction with loops. The program below uses a loop to allow a user to enter 8 integer values, storing those values in the vector, and then printing those 8 values, okay? A vector's size function returns the number of vector elements. In the program below, user vals.size is 8 because the vector was declared with 8 elements, see? So, so we have num_vals be a constant int with 8, and then we declare a vector called user vals with size 8. And I is going to be our index, which is going to be an unsigned int. So enter 8 integer values. So this for loop would iterate starting from 0 to the size of the vector. So this is where the size function is useful. If I actually go back to my old PowerPoint, two other functions that vectors use is the dot size function, which returns the number of elements in the vector in the form of an int. And then we have one other thing that you could use is the empty function. This returns true if the vector is empty or false if otherwise. So because the size of the vector is 8, this loop would iterate 8 times. The user enters 8 values. And then another for loop is shown that outputs the values that the user entered. See? So let's do this participation activity, and then we could call it a night. So the question here says, write a single statement to declare a vector of ints named sales goals with 4 elements, each initialized to 10. Oh, my bad. I should be looking at this one. So refer to the program above. How many times does each for loop iterate? Well, it would iterate according to the size of the vector. And since the size of the vector is 8, I would say that this loop iterates 8 times, right? And then lastly, which one line of code can be changed to allow the user to enter 100 elements? Well, we declared the size of the vector using const int num vals equals 8. So I believe if we changed the 8 to 100, it would change it so that the vector would contain 100 elements instead of 8. So I would say that this is the correct answer, right? Okay, so unfortunately, this is as far as we can get in this session, but I believe you can do the rest on your own time. Vectors it's a very powerful tool to use in C++, chiefly because you can change the size of a vector. You can't change the size of an array. Okay, but anyways, I expect you guys to do the rest of the sections on your own time during the weekend. And if you have any issues doing any part of these sections, like the challenge activities or the participation activities, we can talk about it in our next meeting next Tuesday. So does anyone have any questions before I wrap up this meeting? Or are we good? Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, I will see you guys next Tuesday. Thanks for coming.